Hi, I'm James Michael Riley, and welcome to Worse, Stories of Strength and Endurance from the Old Days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Tonight as we talk, I'm going to be having an O'Doul's, which is what I was having last time. That's something that I just am enjoying as a change up. I'm also going to be just eating little snacks, and I encourage you to do the same. I don't get any money for an endorsement or anything like that. Okay, so yeah, grab something to eat and drink. Stop this if you need to, and we'll get started. Okay, tonight on Worse, smallpox, great pox, cowpox, sucked into a tornado, and the battle to save the buffalo. Okay, for most of human history, smallpox was deadly to 3 in 10 people who got it. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the smallpox was simply spread by the rise of civilization and the advent of trade, and then later of colonization. They have found smallpox pustules on the head of a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy. They don't know where it started, but it's been with humanity for a long time. Some of the symptoms are high fever, headache, backache, a rash that becomes pustules that then scab over, and if you survive, you usually end up with pockmarked skin for the rest of your life. It's spread by coughing, sneezing, breathing, contact with an infected person, even contact with clothing of an infected person, or bedding that they have slept on. There are horrible stories of early settlers to the West trying to eradicate Indians by giving them blankets infected with smallpox. That was one of the vectors of transmission of this disease. So the first preventive measure that people came up with for smallpox was something called variolation. And it wasn't pretty. You would take some of the dried up scabs from smallpox pustules, you'd grind them up, and you would blow them up a person's nose. They would get sick, but they died at a far lower rate than people who got smallpox by the normal rate. It was like 1 in 50 would die instead of 3 out of 10. This system, this was invented in China 2,000 years ago, and it was effective. So the name smallpox is not what its name initially was. It was given that in English in the 16th century to distinguish it from the great pox, which was syphilis, which was a far more prevalent disease than smallpox was in a lot of environments. So the interesting thing, and not very pleasant thing, but the interesting thing about syphilis is that apparently, based on accounts and descriptions that we see from that time period, the symptoms of syphilis were a very different thing than they are in modern society. They also had pustules, which apparently were much more disgusting than the smallpox pustules, bigger and greenish. But it's the nature of the organism that causes syphilis that it evolves at a much quicker rate than, say, humanity does or a lot of other larger species. It's gone through many generations since the 16th century and has had a chance to evolve. What it basically comes down to is if a sexually transmitted disease causes symptoms that make someone less desirable sexually in a very overt visual way, it's not doing a very effective job of propagating itself. So syphilis has evolved to have less horrible symptoms. However, smallpox is not transmitted that way. And so that is not something that drove the evolution of smallpox to become something that was in a noticeably different form from the time when it got its name to more modern times. But this idea of treating it with the dried pustules given to people, variolation is what that process was called, was something that was used through the 1700s in many places where the disease occurred. But in 1770, a British doctor named Fuster observed that farmers didn't get sick from the variolation process, because even people who were successfully treated by it would get kind of sick, but then they'd get better. That farmers who had already had cowpox would not exhibit any symptoms of smallpox when the variolation process and treatment was given to them. So cowpox was a disease of cows' udders that if people milked a cow that had cowpox, they would get a rash on their hands. it was a very similar organism that attacked the body in a similar way, but had much milder symptoms. And Dr. Fuster was part of a group of people that met in the British town of Alveston at an inn called the Ship. So this is one of the first cases in which doctors would meet on a regular basis and share their findings. It was extremely unofficial. They were in an inn. They were drinking and eating while they did it. But as they began to compare notes, they realized, gee, people who got cowpox don't seem to get smallpox or don't get it as severely. So in 1796, another doctor adopted Dr. Fuster's process, and he deliberately inoculated his housekeeper's 11-year-old son with cowpox, and then found, sure enough, that when that kid was variolated with the smallpox organism, he had no symptoms. So this sounds like something that was very cruel on the part of this doctor, but it was something that, two things I would say about that. One is he later did it to his own infant son, the doctor did, and also smallpox was such a serious problem, so deadly, something that even if you survived it would disfigure you for life, that it is something that people wanted to take a chance on avoiding, even if it meant that the treatment could be pretty horrible too. There were instances of people variolating their own children or giving their own children cowpox so that they would not end up getting smallpox. At any rate, this was considered the beginning of vaccines. So vaccination continued through the 1800s, but the process was slow, and the disease at this point was worldwide. It had been spread worldwide by European colonization and probably to some extent by colonization by China at various points in its history. But in the 20th century, National Geographic says that smallpox killed 300 million people worldwide. That is until 1977. So let me tell you what happened. In 1967, the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations, created an intensified eradication program where they began to get the vaccine out very aggressively. And continent by continent, in a fairly short period of time, the remaining cases of smallpox were eradicated. The last place where somebody was, by the normal means, infected with smallpox was in Somalia. The man was a hospital cook. He was misdiagnosed, and then he was correctly diagnosed. He recovered, and that man went on to do good work in the world, and he died in 2013 when he was working on some efforts to eradicate polio in Africa. There was one more person who died of smallpox after that. It was a woman working in a lab in the United Kingdom, which was one of the few remaining places where smallpox was kept. They're not absolutely sure how she was infected by it, but she got it and she died from it. She is the last person to have passed away on planet Earth from smallpox. And in 1980, the World Health Organization declared that the disease had been eliminated worldwide. So for the people who suffered in the process of making this happen, we should be very thankful to them. We should also be very thankful we haven't lived in an era where great pox has the symptoms that it once did, and where smallpox is a problem at all. We're very fortunate to live in the time we do. So thanks to National Geographic, to the Centers for Disease Control and their website, cdc.gov, historyofvaccines.org, and the New England Journal of Medicine. In 2011, says KMBC News, Cade Fiddler was sheltering in a Pizza Hut cooler when a tornado descended, and he was sucked out of the cooler, ripped the door. The tornado ripped the door off the cooler, knocked him against the ground several times, and he blacked out. And he was found some distance away. So he had been sucked up into the tornado. When he was interviewed, he was able to eat the consolation pizza that the camera crew brought with him, despite the fact that his jaw was wired shut. And the reporter for KMBC News said that Cade had always been scared of tornadoes, but maybe even more now. Good insight. The U.S. is the world leader in tornadoes. The National Weather Service provides online a map of the areas where tornadoes occur in the world every year. And no place is as severe as the United States. Every year, Russia gets about 5 tornadoes a year, or at least that's what they report. Australia gets about 20, Canada about 100. The United States gets, on average, 1,200 tornadoes per year. If you look at this map I was just describing, the tornado risk areas are indicated worldwide in red. There's a swatch here, Bangladesh, South Africa, Russia. The United States looks like it bled out on the operating table of tornadoes. Almost the entire country is covered in red, and it goes into Canada and Mexico. Nothing like the US. The most deadly tornado in recorded history was in Bangladesh, but that was not the most severe tornado. I think it was probably just due to their population density, perhaps the poverty of the country and the dwellings in which people were living. But at any rate, we are ground zero for people being sucked into tornadoes. So in 1999, May 3rd, 1999 in Oklahoma, was the worst tornado disaster in U.S. history. You can look it up. It's etched in the consciousness of that state, how horrible that day was, the number of people that were killed, the property damage. I remember it on the front page of the New York Times. It looked like an atomic bomb had gone off in certain sections of Oklahoma City. 18-year-old Amy Crago, as the worst part of the tornado descended upon the home where she lived, was sheltering with her young daughter, her infant daughter, and with her mother. And this tornado, this May 3rd tornado, ripped the house apart. Her daughter Aleah was literally sucked out of her arms by the force of the wind. And as Amy was taken to a hospital, she begged the police to look for her daughter. Policemen about 100 feet away from their home, and I guess this was the following day because the sun was up. I believe that tornado struck at night, although I'm not certain about that. In a pile of mud that was lodged against a tree, he saw what appeared to be a baby. And he picked it up, and it was a baby with mud caked in its ears and its eyes. And as he scraped away the mud, the baby began to cry, and that was little Aleah. She came to be known as the Mud Baby, which I think is a doggone shame. Why couldn't she be called the Tornado Baby? At any rate, apart from minor cuts and bruises, she was relatively unhurt, despite having been carried 100 feet and sucked out of her mother's arms by a tornado. So Answers.com says the longest distance survived by someone carried by a tornado was 1/4 of a mile. But I was skeptical because when I first began to research this, I couldn't find any details. Answers.com did not cite its source. And after all, it's not called AccurateAnswers.com. Although in this case, I got to give credit where it's due, because I found various stories of other people who have been carried by tornadoes on reliable sources like Weather.com, which said that in 1878, a tornado carried the mother of a family 500 yards and her daughters with their arms interlocked 50 yards. However, they didn't survive. But as I looked more, I discovered that Answers.com had it right. In 2006, Matt Suter of Fordland, Missouri, was carried 1,307 feet by a tornado. He was sucked out of a mobile home, and he survived. The Guinness Book of World Records and ABC News both report this fact, and I think those are reliable sources. In fact, interestingly, Guinness says that he achieved the world record at 1,307 feet, although I'm not sure that he achieved much apart from not dying. But at any rate, in terms of worse, and that life can be worse, these stories are a gentle reminder that these are the people who have survived being sucked into a tornado. There are many people who have traveled further without the survival. And most of us listening to this right now are lucky that we've never been sucked into a tornado at all. The battle to save the buffalo. For this segment, I owe its inspiration to the fact that I was reading in the episode of Worst 2 weeks ago, background information on Hugh Glass, the mountain man who survived a grizzly attack in the 1820s in the American West, and that his story is fictionalized in a novel by Michael Punke, if I'm saying that name right, a Montana resident who was also a U.S. trade representative for a while, interestingly. And as I was reading about Michael Punke's book, The Revenant, which was then turned into a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio, book's been translated into 20 languages, I discovered that he also wrote a book called Last Stand, George Bird Grinnell, The Battle to Save the Buffalo and the Birth of the New West. Now, I'd never heard of George Bird Grinnell, and actually I never heard of Michael Punke till The Revenant came out either. But at any rate, when European settlers arrived in North America, scientists estimate that there were 30 million buffalo roaming the American West, mostly in the plains areas from Mexico to Canada, but there were parts of Kentucky were known for having a lot of buffalo. They were all over the place. As the U.S. population expanded, especially after 1800, as the population expanded further beyond the Appalachians and into the Mississippi Valley and the Great Plains, hunters killed the buffalo in huge numbers. They were shot for hides for markets in the eastern part of the United States and in Europe. People shot them for sport from trains, which is a strange concept. Lean out a train window, kill a buffalo, and then don't even bother to pick up the carcass. Just leave it there and shoot some more. Famous Buffalo Bill Cody, who made his living with Wild West shows in the United States and Europe, helping people to enjoy some of the fascination and mystery and allure of the American West, on a hunting trip, or on various hunting trips, in a 2-year period, killed 4,000 buffalo single-handedly. What's darker is that the U.S. government encouraged the killing of buffalo because they wanted to deny food to the Native American tribes that were standing as an obstacle to the expansion of the United States westward. So the process actually in historical terms took just a blink of an eye. In 1871, despite the fact that a lot of killing had already occurred, there was still a herd in Kansas that one observer reported it took 6 days to cross by horse. He said, I can't imagine how many millions of buffalo there are in this herd. That was 1871. But by 1900, there were only a few hundred buffalo left on Earth. So you can imagine the amount of killing that occurred in the intervening 29 years, especially as railroads opened up the West and settlement increased. So George Bird Grinnell was born in 1848. He was a Brooklyn boy, although Brooklyn was a very different thing back then. He lived in Brooklyn because his family wanted to get out of the pestilential vapors of Manhattan. So they moved out to the country, to Brooklyn, where he lived on an estate that had belonged to John James Audubon, the famous naturalist. He got 2 degrees from Yale. So in some ways you could say he was a privileged Eastern dandy. But, and this is part of what inspires me about him, he made numerous expeditions to learn about the nature and also the paleontological history of the West during his summers. In 1874, he joined an expedition by General George Custer to the Black Hills. And when I read that, I thought, now wait a minute. Custer was killed in the Black Hills. That was 2 years later. So this was an earlier expedition. Custer's intentions may have been equally nefarious, but he had some naturalists with him, and Grinnell was one of them. Grinnell actually had a very good relationship with many Native American tribes, and he once went on a hunting expedition with the Pawnee. So I'm trying to imagine what it would be like for most of us living today to go from our relatively comfortable lives to hunting expeditions with the Pawnee and exploratory expeditions with U.S. cavalry in the far west, long before what we would consider civilization had arrived. I have a lot of respect for that kind of toughness. It kind of reminds me of Indiana Jones's character in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he had a precision teaching at a university, but he also went off into the wilderness and the wilds and the jungle and had survival adventures. There was some truth about that in the case of George Bird Grinnell. At any rate, Grinnell became the editor in 1876 of Forest and Stream magazine, apparently not the same thing as Field and Stream, which I was a fan of and a subscriber to when I was a kid, but Forest and Stream, which was published into the 1930s, I think, when it finally closed up business. But, excuse me, in that position as editor of Forest and Stream, he became a strong advocate for preservation of natural resources. And one of them was that Yellowstone Park had been established, but while there were rules against hunting in the national park, there was no provision made in the laws or in government funding for enforcement of those rules. So a lot of poaching went on. And Yellowstone is especially significant in our story because it was one of the few remaining places, and eventually the only remaining place, where a wild herd of buffalo remained. George Bird Grinnell became a big advocate of actually creating funding for enforcement of poaching laws within Yellowstone National Park. By 1900, there were only 23 buffalo left in the wild out of the estimated 30 million that had been there a couple of centuries before. And George Bird Grinnell is one of the main reasons that that number didn't go to zero. So now the wild herds in the U.S. are back to somewhere less than 200,000, and the total number of American bison, which is I think their actual correct name, is about 500,000 if you include those that are on ranches raised for meat. Most of these buffalo are not genetically pure. They have been crossbred with cattle, but this icon has been saved. And given that there is such a thing as like reverse breeding that can be done to bring back an extinct or near extinct species, as is being done with the aurochs, which is a kind of wild buffalo that lived in Europe, there could be hope that we get more genetically or nearly genetically pure buffalo in the future. At any rate, the lesson of George Bird Grinnell's life, I think, are twofold for me. One is that you can have a civilized life and still maintain the toughness to do some interesting and varied things out there in the real world. To hold on to what the historian John Keegan, I thought, very nicely put as a pre-modern ability to endure hardship. I have a hard time imagining a greater compliment than having someone be able to say that about you. But I think Grinnell did do that. Another is that victories, like his victory to save the buffalo, aren't just something that you win one time. It's something that it was something that had to be re-won over and over and over through advocacy in Washington and raising a public consciousness and writing and trips into the wilderness. But he did it. He advocated for environment by fighting against the 19th century view that we're very wise to have let go of. What's one writer called the fallacy of the inexhaustible. That the American West was this vast, endless place where resources could just be gathered and exploited in endless numbers. It's simply not that simple. But having let go of that fallacy, I wonder if we could ask ourselves a better question. What is the inexhaustible resource in us? So thanks to Michael Punke for his book, thanks to pbs.org and sportsafield.com for their contributions to this story. I'm James Michael Riley. Thanks for joining us on Worse, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.